Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. It's time to talk about some more leaks, and after having a look at some individual vehicles, it's time to have a look at the theme of the next update, at least supposedly. It's the theme of the Hungarian Air Force. So, you know how we had update Sons of Attila last year, where they added the Hungarian branch of ground vehicles to the Italian tech tree? Well, the idea is the Hungarian Air Forces will also be added, probably to the Italian tech tree as well. The Hungarians don't have a lot of what I would class as kind of unique vehicles, but they do have some unique variants and also a lot that could offer to the Italian tech tree. The Italian air tech tree isn't actually that bad as well. I know it gets clowned on quite a lot, but for me I actually really enjoy a lot of the Italian propeller aircraft, and even some of their early jets are really fun too. It's worth giving a go if you are into especially World War II aircraft, you'll have a great time. So in this video, we'll have a look at some of the Hungarian stuff that could come in, but just understand they were a nation which used a lot of, I suppose, other people's technologies in the Air Force. So what you'll see from a Hungarian tech tree is not necessarily a ton of new things, even though they could have a few. It's more of the fact that you are bolstering what is already there in the form of kind of similar copy-paste vehicles to others. We already have some Hungarian tech tree vehicles in the game, and you can kind of see the general theme of those ones as well. Anyway, let's get into them. So we can start off with the Hungarian aircraft of the Second World War, but understand that the Hungarians were on the side of the Axis, so the vast majority of the aircraft that they used were of Italian and also German descent. We have a ton of them already in the game, so in this video I'm going to focus on some of the ones which aren't in game yet, even if they are Italian or German, because I think they're pretty cool and also would have a place in the game. Some of them I'm kind of surprised we haven't had yet, but that's at least the idea. The first vehicle is the ME210. This is kind of the Messerschmitt brother that people don't really talk about, and it's because it was such a failure compared to the other variants of it. The ME210 was supposed to be a replacement of the BF110, but it turned out to be so bad, it didn't even replace it. This is why the work on the ME410, which we do have in game, was kind of quickened up because of how unsuccessful the 210 was. The ME210 had a few issues with it. The main problems with it was its actual flight setup. It felt awful to fly. And one of the problems that the Germans had is because they believed in the team which was behind designing it, and also, of course, the just general manufacturers. They ordered 1,000 of them before even the prototype had flown. And then when the prototype flew, specifically with DB601B engines, it was considered unsafe by the test pilots who literally flew it. Basically, the plane had so many different flight model issues. It tended to oscillate. It was awful in turns, and it would just it was very hard to fly, basically. And even after improvements of trying to make it better, they weren't able to do it. They just ended up having a really rough vehicle. Now, when it came to Hungary in this, Hungary actually ordered a bunch of these, and for some reason they actually enjoyed it, probably because they changed the engine, which was one of the major issues with the ME210. The Hungarians specifically used the Daimler-Benz DB605B engines on it, and instead of the 601Bs, which had caused the issues, and actually had some moderate success with it against stuff such as Soviet forces on the Eastern Front. And at the same time, this thing is heavily armed. You know, it has 220mm, it has the 7.92mm, has the turrets, you know, in the back, the good old remotely operated one that you see on the 410, and it could also carry a bunch of bombs and everything. The major issue with it was the flight characteristics were just so bad. It's just kind of interesting how you create a machine to be able to replace the BF110, and what ends up happening is you have to continue to use the BF110 because the machine that was designed to replace it was just so bad. But yeah, there's also a variant, technically, that the Hungarians could get, which was modified to have 40mm Bofors autocannons. So don't know exactly how that would have worked, and also could carry very large rockets. So that could be interesting to see. Not entirely sure, as I said, how that would happen. You also have the Caproni CA310. This was developed from the CA309, shouldn't really be a surprise, and it was one of these recon/bombers. So a lot of people used it for reconnaissance. It had, the twin engine setup, but at the same time, since it was very similar to a lot of other bombers, it could also be used as a bomber. It did have access to bombs up to 450 kilos of it could carry, and also had some defensive armament too, in the form of some Breda Safat machine guns. Of course, it's built by Caproni, so it is Italian. It was used by a ton of different nations once again, not entirely in a bombing role, but mainly in reconnaissance. And when you have a look at Hungary, they were one of those which pretty much used it for reconnaissance. They didn't like the vehicle that much, and a lot of people didn't, and the basic reason is because just like a lot of these early war or pre-World War II aircraft, especially the bombers that Italy were using, the engines just weren't good enough. And you actually see that with a lot of examples in the game right now, but the CA310 is no different, with two Piaggio Stella P7C engines with 470 horsepower each. This thing was slow and generally wouldn't have a great range either, so recon-wise, it could probably sort some stuff out, but it would also get caught while trying to do it. One of the more interesting things about Hungary is they actually have quite a lot of trainers, and these trainers, will focus on some of the more modern ones, but they also have some old ones. The Arado AR-96 was kind of one of the main trainer fighters during the Second World War. It was manufactured by Arado, and it came out just before the First World War. Its first flight was in 1937, and it was started to be used as a test, not a test flight aircraft, but a training aircraft in 1939. It was all metal, and also at the same time did have armed variants, so that could be used. It had one which had access to one 7.92mm MG17. This was the B2, which would be kind of interesting to see. They made a ton of these, by the way, and was one of the main trainers in the war. It has a really interesting history behind it as well, and definitely worth looking into this one. There's a ton of really interesting trainers during the Second World War. A lot of them are biplanes, but this one, being kind of a all-metal monoplane, kind of stood out, which is pretty interesting. It was powered by an Argus AS410A1 engine, which had 465 horsepower on it, could only go 330 kilometers an hour, but it also had a crew of two, because it was a training machine. So kind of interesting to see, and hopefully we could see this type of version. There was also some variants which technically could carry ground ordnance if it wanted to, but yeah, not really ever done since it was a training aircraft. You also do have some unique Hungarian vehicles, though, such as the EVGA. This was a Hungarian aircraft which was derived from the Reggiani RE2000, which is from Italy. But they took a bunch of RE2000s, I believe around 70 of them were delivered to Italy, and what they ended up doing is improving them in the ways that, Hungary wanted. First of all, they re-engined it, so they gave it the Weiss Manfred WMK14 engine, they gave it an additional fuel tank, and also at the same time gave it some armor for the pilot, which I think is quite nice. Another thing they also changed was the general armament of the machine. Instead of using the standard Breda Safats, which the vehicle would have, it had access to two 12.7mm Gebauer 1940M GKM engine-driven machine guns. So generally that could actually be very different compared to some of the other ones. That was one of the modifications they did to the Hedger 2, though. The Hedger 1 would have the more standard guns on it. And also, at the same time, you could technically have one which would have access to bombs as well. But so you would have a Reggiani 2000, but the internals were completely different from the Italian vehicle and more kind of structured for the good old Hungarian setup. The WMK-14B had 1,085 horsepower, and it was actually a license-built derivative of the Nomron 14K FRS Mistral Major, which is pretty cool. You also have the EVGA. Now, this one could technically be added, but it's a little bit all over the place. It's the RMI 1XH. This was technically the world's first turboprop aircraft, and the vehicle itself, it was built in the Second World War by a Hungarian designer, good old Laszlo Varga, and the idea of it was obviously to use some pretty powerful engines. It used the Gendra 6 CS1 turboprop engines, and it had two of them. This gave it 2,000 horsepower in total. The vehicle never really did too much though, and also because they were having engine issues, they decided in the late war, so in 1944, to replace the engines with DB605 engines, which they were using on their Me-210s. They actually got a license to produce the DB605, and that's when they did the switch. The vehicle never really went anywhere, but it at least holds the title of being one of the world's first turboprop aircraft, and since we don't have too many in War Thunder, it'd be kinda cool to see. The major issue, though, is it doesn't really have any armament, and also this one was destroyed in 1944 when it got bombed to all hell. During the Cold War period, of course, Hungary was under the veil of the Soviet Union, so they used a bunch of USSR aircraft. Yak-9, Tu-2, Il-28, MiG-15, MiG-21, MiG-19, 23, Su-22, MiG-29s even, which were delivered for a slightly different reason, because the good old Russian government was trying to pay off a debt. But the main thing is they used all of the standard Soviet vehicles. That's really not going to be that interesting. Right now, today, they actually do use the Gripen as well, the JAS, the JS-39C, and also D, the D being the two-seater variant of the C, and the C, of course, being the NATO compatible version of the Gripen. So, you have the good old Gripen for the Hungarians too, so maybe we see that. But the main thing, or the main thrust that you're getting from them during the Cold War period is a bunch of standard Soviet vehicles. They do have some pretty cool vehicles. They're not Hungarian, but Hungary used them. The first one is the Aero L-29 Delfin. This one is of Czechoslovakian descent, and it was the first ever jet kind of trainer which was used by the Eastern Bloc. It was also Czechoslovakia's first locally designed and constructed jet aircraft, which is pretty cool. A lot of different nations use this. Obviously, the Soviets themselves, parts of Africa also use this, and of course Hungary too. They made over 3,000 of these things, so they really got shared around the place, and it was mainly used, obviously, as a trainer. A lot of it was actually used in private settings too, once again, mainly as a trainer. It was a turbojet aircraft. It had the Motolet M701C in it. It was able to go, around 600, 700 kilometers an hour, and also technically it had some hard points that you could arm with. It had two 7.62mm machine gun pods, and also it could carry some rockets and bombs too, so you could have a little bit of fun with those as well. Overall, it was super successful and did its job really well, and that's why it's kind of remembered as this really good military trainer. Isn't really used too much anymore though, since better offerings have turned up. One of those offerings is the Aero L39NG. This is the next generation jet trainer, and basically it was introduced, I think, around about 2020 or just before then. Its first flights are in the 2010s, so this is a very modern kind of jet trainer, which means, of course, it has access to some pretty cool bells and whistles as a vehicle, which would have, bombs, rockets, stuff like that. And there's a ton of orders which have been around from this machine. Obviously, since it's pretty new, the serial production of it only started a few years ago, so a lot of the orders haven't come through yet, but it is one of those which Hungary could maybe get access to. The vehicle itself can carry a lot of ordnance. It uses the Williams International FJ44-4M turbofan engine and can go a maximum speed of 900 kilometers an hour. So not too bad for the vehicle, but it can also carry up to 1,200 kilos worth of ordnance, and this is pretty impressive. It has 5 external hardpoints. It can carry laser-guided munitions. It can carry also air-to-air or air-to-ground gun pods as well, and is mainly designed for, of course, ground attack, but could carry some IR-seeking AA missiles as well, which would be insanely modern too. So overall, this vehicle would be very similar to stuff like the AMX that we have in the game, where it has okay flight performance, but its main deal is actually training. You can see that Hungary itself has a lot to offer in many different areas, and even though a lot of it, you may have seen before, or could be in different nations, if they decide to put a sub-tree in, you could at least put a bunch of unique stuff in it. As always, look after yourselves, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Schnitzel Stroker, Brendan Quinn, Vilneus, Character Fuel, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Gus Irenicus, Pyman, Wartinder, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, B. Young, Opium Prime, Masonocrat, Lafouche, Alan Hacker, Sem Arslan, Uncle Bean, and Derek R. for supporting the channel.